Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Prayerful Pause with the Pastor. This is Thursday's edition titled Size Matters. We're talking all this week about how we are changed by the resurrection or how we are able to change ourselves, how we are responsible for kind of mapping out our response to transformation, to the new hope, the new life, the new possibilities offered to us as post-resurrection people. And we're looking at both ourselves and our faith communities, wherever they may be, churches or otherwise. And to kind of start today, I want you to think for a minute about when you were in grade school. Think way back there. How many best friends would you say that you had then? Because if you're like most kids, it was like everybody was your best friend. And, you probably had 10 best friends, whoever was in your class. Then as you get a little older, we become a little more discerning, and we look at friends, acquaintances, close friends, best friends, and so the number changes. The size of the circles change. They morph off from each other. And maybe you have a big circle of acquaintances, and maybe even it's a concentric circle, and you have your closest friends, and then as you get out, they're acquaintances. The size of the group changes as we get older. The same is true. I want to talk about today mostly about churches, because church size is changing dramatically and drastically, as we all know. All you have to do is look at the research, and you see the dramatic reduction in church size and in numbers of churches over the last 10 years. Now, there are many different words to describe it, but essentially I think personally in terms of 4 different categories of churches. There's the mega church, 1,000 or more members. Some people will say 2,000 or more, but there are mega churches. Then we have programmatic churches, and there are a couple divisions in that, but for today we're just going to call them programmatic churches, where everything is program oriented and you have an organizational structure that's going to ensure that the programs, the ministries are carried out in an effective way, and that there's some supervision or something for that. When you get down below 200, it kind of shifts. The dynamics of the group shifts, and I think of those as family churches. Many people will call them family churches. And if you're down, well, a lot of people will say below 50, but really you need to have something like 88 people or something to support a traditional church. So we could say anything under that, but I'm going to say from 50 and below. It might not be a church. It might be a fellowship or a chapel. Something where you don't attempt to do everything that a church would normally do, to have all of the programs. Maybe all of your 50 people are over the age of 60, so you're probably not going to have youth programs or Sunday school, Christian ed for kids. Those kinds of distinctions get made. In the Presbyterian system, we have forms of government that can adjust to each of those. But I want to talk, and we're still talking about how we are transformed by this Resurrection Day. And that means how our definition of our own identity changes. It changes for each of those 4 groups. If I am in a very small group, and some of you have experienced this, you're in a very small group, and then you go and you join a church that's larger, you really have to adjust, don't you, to a different way of thinking about church. Especially if you go from, let's say, a family church of 120 people, you can pretty much know all 120 people. But if you go to a large programmatic church where you've got 800 people, you may not even know the names of people who are sitting in the pew next to you, let alone knowing their kids or their parents or their life stories. So the dynamic changes a lot depending on the size of the church. If you are involved in church leadership, then the leadership style has to change too. Programmatic churches, especially those that shrink and now become family churches, the programs aren't half as important as the relationships. And relationships can get hampered by too much organizational structure. You want to have it be more loosey-goosey, like when families get together, right? You have some structure to make the buffet dinner run okay, the smorgasbord when everybody's together, but you're not going to structure all your time together and yada yada yada. But you would if it's a huge family reunion of 800 people, you have to have that organization. If it's a small group of 150, not so much. And that's where a lot of churches that I work with run into trouble, because they've changed size, either increasing or decreasing, but they don't change their understanding of their identity. It can also be true around money. For many years, I worshiped in a church that considered itself to be a very poor church. And yet, increasingly over the years that I was there, they had more and more professional people. They had doctors and lawyers and judges and surgeons and professors, and yet they still had this image of themselves as a really poor church, like when they started out 50 years ago. So it's kind of like 2 days ago when I talked about the church formerly known as, no, I guess that was yesterday, we talked about the church formerly known as, they were formerly known as a poor church, but they weren't anymore. And some of us, South Church and Downtown in particular, we were formerly known as large churches. South had 800 members, Downtown probably as many, maybe close to 1,000, and neither one of them has that now. Both of those churches are family-sized churches. South is even pushing the edge of that. Kind of difficult to explain with all of our acts of faith. If you count everybody in the acts of faith, we're squarely a family church. We've got 150 people every week involved in things. If you're looking just at membership, it's below 50, so we'd be talking about a fellowship or a chapel. But Downtown Church is kind of in that family area. So what does that mean? Well, it means we have to change our identity, change it internally, not be expecting that we're doing everything that we were when we were larger. Mostly, though, not expecting that we're going to do it the same way that we used to do it when we were larger. Same is true if you're going from small to large, I want to underscore. Throughout church history, God has used small communities to change things. Like, think of it like a small amount of yeast to raise a whole loaf of bread, right? Well, my friend, the Reverend Dr. Rachel McGuire, uses the term eschatological communities. And she talks about those communities that are small, that are listening to the Spirit, and therefore become the yeast, bringing about great change beyond just the walls of their church or the neighborhood of their church, if they're a church without walls. And so we don't need size in order to be effectual, and we don't need size in order to accomplish great things and do the work that we are called to do. The same, I would add, is true of our own lives, going back to our circle of friends. We don't need to have a lot of friends. We need to have a few very good friends who are going to stand by us, who make sure that we become part of extended family, I guess. We have to define, during this period of transformation, this post-resurrection, when we're being invited to change our self-definition and our identity, we have to get really clear on who we are. Because, for instance, if you're going from a large church that's programmatic down to a family-sized church, that means that you have to have more leaders. There has to be more interaction. It can't all be done through the structure of an organization. You may have a very elaborate corporate structure, but that's corporate. When you're talking about under 200 people, you don't want corporate. You're talking familial. And just think of the difference between those two approaches to life, something that's corporate and something that's family-based, right? They're very different. How does that affect you and me as individuals? Well, we have to change our headset about how we fit in to these different groups. And are we part of a larger organizational structure in the programmatic church, Or are we really putting our time and energy into building the relationships that we need to have in a family church? I don't have any answers today. I'm just raising a lot of questions because that's my job. My job is to raise the questions, but to get us thinking of something greater than ourselves. And in this case, it has to do with the identity of our organizations, churches or others, and how does that affect or relate to our personal identity? Where is it that we fit in? And if we want to be really in a corporate structure and this body is too small for that, we need to go someplace else. Or vice versa. If we really want to be in a family kind of environment where everybody is relating as familial members, and we find ourselves in a larger programmatic church, that's probably not going to feel good to us. Has nothing to do with the wonderful things either church does. It has to do with finding what's right for us. So your assignment for today is to take this understanding, this thought about the different sizes and how groups interact in those different sizes, and figure out what is it that is right for you. Now, I haven't talked very much at all about 50 members and less becoming a chapel or a fellowship. Basically, in Presbyterian terms, what that means is that that group really would not be a church anymore. They can't field a session anymore. It's what you have to be a Presbyterian church. You have to have a session of elders, at least 3. And if a church isn't able to do that, either because people are too elderly, or they have no desire to because they've all been there and done that, or it's because they're ministering to populations that are transient or that don't have really the interest or the mental capacity to run a church, then you have to look at a different structure for a group that size, right? And you have to find where you fit in this structure. And maybe you want to go find a mega church. Maybe that suits you. I don't have any experience with them, so I really can't tell you about that. But for today, I want you to think about yourself. Think about these different groups. Think about your own life, and where do you think you are most comfortable fitting in? Okay? All right. I'm Pastor Deb Swift of both South and Downtown Presbyterian Churches in Rochester, New York. Thank you for joining me for this prayerful pause with the pastor. Time to think of something greater than ourselves. In this week past Easter, it's looking at how the resurrection has offered us an opportunity to take a hard look at our identity, both individually and corporately. And what does that mean for our work ahead on ourselves or as the church? All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you back here tomorrow, I hope. And until then, God bless. Take care. And bye for now.